December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida looked down from his Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber at the chaos unfolding below and transmitted the signal that would echo through history. Tora, Tora, Tora. Complete surprise achieved. Below him, the Pacific Fleet burned. Battleships that had represented the backbone of American naval power were sinking in the shallow harbor mud. Aircraft that had never left the ground were burning in neat rows on the airfields. The attack had achieved everything Japanese planners had promised and more. In 90 minutes, Japan had done what many American naval officers had quietly feared for years, demonstrated that the era of the battleship was over and the aircraft carrier had become the decisive weapon of naval warfare. What Fuchida and the Japanese High Command did not fully appreciate in the triumphant hours after Pearl Harbor was that they had simultaneously created the conditions for their own destruction. The attack that was supposed to break American will had instead focused it. The nation that Japanese planners had dismissed as too comfortable, too divided, and too democratic to sustain a serious war effort had been handed the one thing that could unify it completely. And somewhere in the factories and design offices of American aviation, engineers who had been studying the Zero fighter that Japan had used to dominate the Pacific sky since 1940 were already working on the answer. That answer would be called the Grumman F6F Hellcat. And when it arrived in the Pacific in the summer of 1943, it would begin a systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation so complete that within a year, Japan's ability to wage carrier warfare would be effectively finished. The pilots who had swept from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon without losing a carrier battle, the men who had made the Zero synonymous with death for American aviators from the Philippines to Midway, would find themselves fighting an aircraft specifically engineered to kill them. This is the story of how American industrial intelligence and engineering genius designed a weapon to defeat a specific enemy, and how that weapon fulfilled its purpose so completely that the most experienced naval aviators Japan had ever produced were swept from the sky in numbers that their country could never replace. To understand what the Hellcat meant, you have to understand what the Zero had been. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1940 and had immediately established itself as the most capable carrier fighter in the world. Its performance specifications were so impressive that when American intelligence first received reports of its capabilities from Chinese sources who had encountered it over China, the reports were dismissed as exaggeration. American aviation experts reviewing the specifications concluded that no aircraft with those performance characteristics could actually exist. The climb rate was too high. The range was too long. The maneuverability was too exceptional. Something had to be wrong with the intelligence. Nothing was wrong with the intelligence. The Zero could climb faster than any American fighter. It could turn more tightly than any American fighter. Its range of over 1,600 miles made it capable of operations that American planners had assumed were impossible for a carrier-based aircraft. In the hands of pilots who had been flying and fighting since the China campaign, it was a weapon of extraordinary lethality. The secret of the Zero's performance was also its fatal weakness, a weakness that American engineers would eventually exploit with devastating effect. Jiro Horikoshi, the Mitsubishi engineer who designed the Zero, had achieved its extraordinary performance by stripping away everything that wasn't absolutely essential to flight and combat. Armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, structural reinforcement that would have added weight. Everything that made an aircraft survivable when hit was removed from the Zero in order to make it lighter, faster, and more maneuverable. The result was an aircraft that performed brilliantly when its pilot was in control of the engagement and was catastrophically fragile when it was not. A Zero that caught fire when hit by machine gun fire did not give its pilot time to bail out. A Zero that took structural damage in a high-speed dive could come apart before the pilot understood what was happening. The aircraft that was nearly impossible to kill in a turning fight could be destroyed with a single burst from the right angle if you could get to that angle. Getting to that angle had been the problem. American pilots flying the Brewster Buffalo and early Grumman F4F Wildcat had discovered to their cost in the first months of the Pacific War that fighting the Zero on its own terms was suicide. The Zero's superior maneuverability meant that any turning fight favored the Japanese pilot. The tactics that American pilots had trained with, the diving attacks and turning pursuits that had characterized fighter combat in the European theater, simply did not work against an aircraft that could outturn and outclimb anything the Americans had in the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. The men who figured out how to survive against the Zero did so through the brutal process of learning from the men who didn't survive. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one of the most gifted tactical thinkers in American naval aviation, developed what became known as the Thatch Weave, a two-aircraft offensive tactic that allowed Wildcat pilots to protect each other against the Zero's superior maneuverability. The tactic saved lives and allowed American pilots to survive engagements that would otherwise have been one-sided massacres. But surviving was not the same as winning. The Zero still dominated the Pacific sky through 1942. The real solution required better intelligence and better engineering. The intelligence breakthrough came in June 1942, when a Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga was flying Zero combat air patrol over the Aleutian Islands during a Japanese attack on Dutch Harbor, Alaska. Koga was hit by ground fire and attempted to land on a nearby island. His aircraft flipped on landing and Koga died in the crash. When American forces reached the scene, they found something that American aviation engineers had wanted since December 1941, an intact Zero in flyable condition. The aircraft was carefully recovered, shipped to the United States, repaired, and put through an exhaustive flight test program at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. American test pilots flew it against every American fighter available. They measured its performance at every altitude and in every flight regime. They found its strengths and its weaknesses with the systematic precision of engineers who understood that the information they were gathering would determine how many American pilots lived and how many died. The test results confirmed what some experienced American pilots had already suspected. The Zero was extraordinarily maneuverable at low and medium speeds, but its controls became dangerously heavy at high speeds, making it difficult to maneuver in high-speed dives. Its light construction made it vulnerable to damage that an American aircraft could absorb without catastrophic consequences. And its performance fell off significantly at higher altitudes, above 20,000 feet, where American aircraft with more powerful engines could neutralize much of the Zero's advantage. The engineers at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island had actually begun designing the aircraft that would become the Hellcat before the captured Zero was available for testing. Leroy Grumman and his team had been working from combat reports and intelligence assessments that described the Zero's capabilities and from their own understanding of what American pilots needed to survive against it. When the test results from Koga Zero became available, they confirmed that Grumman was on the right track and provided specific data points that allowed refinements to be made. What Grumman designed was the philosophical opposite of the Zero. Where Horikoshi had stripped away everything to achieve performance, Grumman built everything in. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the output of the Saburo Sakai engine. The airframe was built to absorb punishment that would have destroyed 3 Zeros. The pilot sat behind armor plate that could stop rifle-caliber bullets. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, meaning a bullet that punctured them would cause the rubber lining to expand and seal the hole rather than allowing fuel to pour out and ignite. The Hellcat was not as maneuverable as the Zero. Grumman knew this and accepted it as a deliberate design choice. The aircraft that was heavier, more powerful, and more survivable could not match the Zero in a slow-speed turning fight. But it didn't need to. The entire tactical concept behind the Hellcat was to deny the Zero the turning fight it needed to win and instead impose a combat environment where American advantages, speed, power, firepower, and structural strength would be decisive. The 6.50 caliber machine guns that the Hellcat carried were themselves a statement of American industrial philosophy. 6 guns with 400 rounds each created a weight of fire that could destroy a Zero in a fraction of a second. Japanese pilots accustomed to aircraft that could absorb machine gun hits and keep fighting discovered that the Hellcat's guns did not leave that option open. A Hellcat that achieved firing position on a Zero for even a brief moment was likely to end the engagement permanently. The Hellcat flew for the first time in June 1942. It entered fleet service in January 1943. The first combat deployment came in August 1943, when Hellcats of VF-9 from the Essex and VF-5 from the Yorktown engaged Japanese aircraft over Marcus Island. The results of that first engagement were not dramatic, 3 Japanese aircraft destroyed, but they confirmed what American pilots who had flown the Hellcat in training had believed. The aircraft worked. The real test came in November 1943, during the assault on Tarawa and Marken Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. American carriers operating in support of the amphibious assault came under attack from Japanese land-based aircraft and faced Japanese carrier fighters. The Hellcats defending the fleet destroyed 30 Japanese aircraft in the first day of operations. Japanese pilots who survived reported encounters with an American fighter that was fundamentally different from anything they had faced before. The aircraft that Japanese aviators had been trained to dismiss as slow and unmaneuverable was neither slow nor unmaneuverable in the way they had expected. The tactical picture that emerged from the first months of Hellcat operations was clear to both sides. When Japanese pilots attempted to engage Hellcats in the slow-speed turning fights that had been their standard tactic against American fighters, they found that Hellcat pilots had been trained to refuse those engagements. The vertical tactics that American fighter doctrine had developed, diving from altitude, firing, and zooming back up using energy gained in the dive, gave Hellcat pilots the ability to choose when and how engagements occurred. A Japanese pilot who wanted to turn fight a Hellcat found himself turning alone, while the American climbed away and reset for another pass. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhorter became the first Hellcat ace, achieving his 5th aerial victory on November 23, 1943. McWhorter was 22 years old, from Athens, Georgia, and he would finish the war with 12 victories. His description of Hellcat combat tactics was clinical and precise. You didn't get into a turning contest with the Zero. You used your speed and your altitude. You came in fast, you fired, and you climbed back out. If you did it right, the engagement was over before the Japanese pilot fully understood what had happened. The acceleration toward decisive engagement came in early 1944 as American carrier forces began the systematic campaign across the Central Pacific that would bring them to the Japanese home islands. Operation Flintlock, the assault on Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands in January and February 1944, saw Hellcat pilots destroy Japanese air power over the target island so completely that the amphibious landings proceeded with minimal air opposition. The pattern would repeat itself across the Pacific, American carriers arriving, Hellcats sweeping the sky, ground forces landing against opposition that lacked air cover. The Japanese were aware of what was happening. Their intelligence reports described the new American fighter with increasing alarm. The pilots who survived encounters with Hellcats reported that the tactics they had developed against previous American fighters were not working. The High Command responded by attempting to develop new tactics and by pushing its pilot training programs to produce replacements for the experienced aviators who were dying in increasing numbers. The replacement pilot problem was itself a consequence of earlier Japanese decisions. The extraordinary pilots who had flown at Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea, at Midway, had been products of a training program that prioritized quality over quantity, spending years developing each pilot to the highest possible standard. Japan had gone to war with approximately 3,000 carrier-qualified naval aviators of exceptional skill. The losses at Coral Sea, Midway, and the grinding attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign had consumed a significant portion of that experienced cadre. Each experienced pilot lost took years to replace at the original training standards. Japan responded to the shortage by shortening training programs and lowering standards. The replacement pilots arriving at fleet units by 1943 and 1944 had fewer flight hours, less gunnery training, and less experience in formation flying and tactical coordination than the men they were replacing. They were flying an aircraft, the Zero, that had been designed around the assumption that the pilot would be exceptional. In the hands of a pilot who was merely competent, the Zero's advantages were reduced and its vulnerabilities were exposed. The Hellcat, by contrast, had been designed with the understanding that the average American pilot, trained to a high but not extraordinary standard, needed to be able to fight and win. The aircraft's forgiving handling characteristics, its stability as a gun platform, and its ability to absorb battle damage and bring its pilot home meant that a pilot who made mistakes in combat had a better chance of surviving those mistakes than his Japanese counterpart. Survival meant the opportunity to learn. Learning meant improvement. The American pilot who survived his first combat engagement was measurably better prepared for his second than he had been for his first. The gap between American and Japanese pilot quality widened with every month of combat. By the spring of 1944, American fighter pilots were not just better equipped than their opponents. Many of them were individually more experienced and more skilled, the product of a training system that had been systematically improved and a combat environment that allowed its best pilots to accumulate victories and pass their knowledge to newer rivals. The convergence of superior aircraft, superior numbers, and increasingly superior pilot quality reached its climax in June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle in history and the engagement that American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Saburo Sakai had assembled 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers for the operation. Saka's plan relied on his land-based aircraft in the Mariana Islands supplementing his carrier air groups to achieve numerical parity with the American forces. He believed his pilots, fighting from a defensive position and supported by land-based air, could inflict losses on the American fleet sufficient to check the American advance toward Japan. What Saka did not know was that American submarines had found his fleet and were tracking it. What he did not know was that American aircraft had destroyed most of the land-based aircraft he was counting on in raids the day before the battle. What he did not know was that American radar and fighter direction systems had been refined to a level of effectiveness that his tactical planning had not accounted for. On June 19, 1944, Ozawa launched 4 major strike waves against the American fleet, sending 373 aircraft toward the American task force in the largest single day of carrier air operations in the Pacific War. The Hellcats rose to meet them. What followed was the most one-sided major air battle in the history of naval warfare. American fighter direction officers aboard the carriers tracked the incoming Japanese strikes on radar and vectored Hellcat squadrons to intercept at altitude, above the Japanese formations, with the energy advantage of altitude and the tactical advantage of surprise. Japanese pilots who had been trained to expect American fighters to be slow and easy to engage found themselves under attack from above by aircraft they could not outrun and could not outclimb, and that fired with a weight of metal that their aircraft could not survive. The first Japanese strike wave, 69 aircraft, lost 42 of them before reaching the American fleet. The second wave of 130 aircraft lost 97. The third wave of 47 aircraft lost 7 to Hellcats, and another 40 to anti-aircraft fire from the fleet. The fourth wave of 82 aircraft, diverted to land-based airfields rather than returning to their carriers, was intercepted and largely destroyed. When the day ended, Japan had lost 346 aircraft. The United States had lost 29, a ratio of nearly 12 to 1. American pilots flying home in the darkness after the battle's final engagements were running low on fuel, when Admiral Mitscher made a decision that violated every principle of carrier operation at night in a combat zone. He ordered the fleet to turn on its lights. Every ship in the task force illuminated its running lights, its searchlights, its deck lights, to guide his pilots home. The Japanese submarines that were operating in the area could see those lights from miles away. Mitscher accepted that risk because his pilots were running out of fuel in the dark Pacific, and he was not going to let them die in the water after what they had done that day. 80 aircraft were lost in water landings and deck crashes during the recovery operation. Most of the pilots and crew were rescued. The human cost of that night was painful. The alternative, letting those pilots ditch in the dark Pacific without the lights to guide them to the fleet, was unacceptable to Mitscher. He lit the fleet and accepted the consequences. The Japanese pilots who had survived June 19th returned to their carriers to report what they had encountered. Their after-action reports described American fighters that seemed to be everywhere, that attacked from positions they couldn't counter, that could not be shaken in a dive and could not be matched in a climb. The Hellcat had performed exactly as Grumman's engineers had designed it to perform. It had denied the Zero every situation in which the Zero's advantages were relevant, and imposed instead the combat conditions where the Hellcat's advantages were decisive. The 2 Japanese fleet carriers sunk by American submarines during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Shokaku and the Taiho, were among the most experienced carrier units in the Japanese Navy. The Shokaku had been at Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea, at the Eastern Solomons. The pilots who died with those ships carried institutional knowledge that Japan had been accumulating since the 1930s. That knowledge went to the bottom of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, and Japan had no way to replace it. The scale of Japanese aviation losses in 1944 can be understood through a single comparison. Japan began the war with approximately 3,000 highly trained carrier pilots. By the end of 1944, the Japanese carrier force was so depleted of experienced aviators that at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese carriers were used as decoys rather than as strike forces, because there were not enough trained pilots to make them effective as offensive weapons. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had ranged from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific as the most powerful offensive naval force in the world, had been reduced to bait. The Hellcat's contribution to this outcome was central and quantifiable. By the end of the Pacific War, Hellcat pilots had been credited with 5,223 aerial victories, approximately 75% of all enemy aircraft destroyed by American naval aviation during the war. The aircraft had achieved a kill ratio of 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in aerial combat. 19 to 1. That ratio represented the intersection of superior design, superior training, superior numbers, and superior industrial capacity. The Hellcat that killed 19 Japanese aircraft for everyone it lost was not simply a better aircraft than the Zero, though it was better suited to the specific combat environment of the Pacific War. It was the product of a system that could produce thousands of them, that could train thousands of pilots to fly them effectively, and that could replace both aircraft and pilots when they were lost in a way that Japan simply could not match. Lieutenant Commander Edward Henry O'Hare, for whom Chicago's O'Hare International Airport is named, had been the Navy's first ace and its first aviation medal of honor recipient, shooting down 5 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement in February 1942 while flying a Wildcat. O'Hare was killed in November 1943 in the first night fighter operation ever attempted from an American carrier. He never flew the Hellcat in combat. But the aircraft that replaced the Wildcat he had flown fulfilled the promise of what O'Hare and the pilots of his generation had demonstrated was possible, that American naval aviation, given the right equipment and the right training, could defeat the best that Japan could put in the air. The pilots who flew the Hellcat in combat spoke of it with the particular affection that fighting men develop for weapons that bring them home alive. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace with 34 aerial victories, described the Hellcat as the finest fighting aircraft of the war. On October 24, 1944, McCampbell engaged a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft with his wingmen and shot down 9 of them in a single mission record for American aviation in the Second World War. When he landed, his guns were empty and his fuel was nearly exhausted. He refueled, rearmed, and went back up. That quality, the willingness to refuel and go back up, to keep fighting as long as there were enemies to fight and aircraft to fight them with, was not specific to McCampbell or to Hellcat pilots or to naval aviation. It was a characteristic of the American military experience in the Pacific War that Japanese planners had fundamentally miscalculated when they planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan had gone to war believing that American democracy was a weakness, that a society built on individual comfort and individual rights could not sustain the sacrifices that modern war required. The Hellcat was one of many proofs that they were wrong. The aircraft that destroyed Japanese naval aviation was designed by American engineers in American factories, flown by American pilots trained in American training programs, maintained by American mechanics working on American carriers built in American shipyards. The entire system that produced the Hellcat and the men who flew it was a product of the democratic industrial society that Japan had dismissed. The Zero was a masterpiece of individual engineering genius, the product of Jiro Horikoshi's extraordinary talent applied to the specific requirements of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It achieved performance specifications that American experts had believed were impossible. In the right hands, flown by the right pilot under the right conditions, it was a superb combat aircraft. The Hellcat was not a masterpiece in the same sense. It was something more significant. It was the product of a system, a systematic process of intelligence gathering, engineering analysis, industrial production, pilot training, and tactical development that produced not the perfect aircraft but the right aircraft, the aircraft that gave American pilots what they needed to win the specific war they were fighting. When Japan's most experienced pilots climbed into their Zeros in the summer of 1944 and found Hellcats waiting for them, they discovered the answer to the question that American engineers had been working on since December 1941. The answer flew at 380 miles per hour, climbed at 3,500 feet per minute, and fired 6.50 caliber machine guns that fired 800 rounds per minute each. The answer was American. It had been American all along. Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's greatest surviving ace with 64 aerial victories, who had been flying combat since 1938 and who survived the war despite being severely wounded in 1942, was asked after the war what had determined the outcome of the air war in the Pacific. His answer was both simple and complete. The Hellcat, he said. When the Hellcat arrived, we knew the mathematics had changed. Before the Hellcat, we could trade losses and survive. After the Hellcat, every engagement cost us pilots we could not replace flying against pilots who kept getting better. We were not defeated by better pilots. We were defeated by a better system. America built the system that could win the war. We built aircraft. They built everything else that was needed to use them. The last Japanese carrier operation of the Pacific War, the sortie of the battleship Yamato toward Okinawa in April 1945 with enough fuel for a one-way trip, was covered by exactly 0 carrier aircraft. Japan had carriers. It did not have the pilots to fly from them. The men who might have flown those missions were gone, destroyed in the Philippine Sea and over a ball and in the grinding attrition of 2 years of combat against an opponent whose industrial system replenished everything it lost while Japan's system produced less and less of what it needed more and more of. The Hellcat had done what it was designed to do. It had found and destroyed the Zero's pilots in number sufficient to end Japan's ability to contest American air superiority. In doing so, it had made possible everything that followed: the island hopping campaign, the B-29 bombing offensive, the ultimate victory in the Pacific. When the Japanese delegation signed the surrender documents on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, American aircraft flew in formation overhead. Among them were Hellcats, the aircraft that had swept the Pacific sky of the opposition that might have made those surrender ceremonies unnecessary for years. The war was over. The Hellcat had helped end it. Grumman would go on to build aircraft that flew to the moon. The engineers who designed the Hellcat applied the same systematic philosophy that had produced it: identify the problem precisely, design the solution specifically, build it to survive and to perform to the challenges of the jet age and the space age. The F-14 Tomcat that protected American carriers during the Cold War was a direct descendant, in philosophy and in engineering culture, of the F-6F Hellcat that had cleared the Pacific sky of Japanese opposition in 1944. But the Hellcat's place in history was secured not in what came after but in what it accomplished in the specific time and place it was designed for. The Pacific War of 1943 and 1944, when Japan still had the pilots and the aircraft to contest American advance, was the crucible in which the Hellcat proved itself. It proved itself in 19 victories for every loss. It proved itself in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It proved itself in the empty flight decks of Japanese carriers that had no pilots left to fly from them. And it proved itself in the survival of the American pilots who came home from the Pacific to build the post-war world because they had flown an aircraft that was specifically designed to bring them home. That is what the Hellcat was. Not just a fighter aircraft. Not just a collection of engineering specifications and performance data. It was the answer to a question that Japan had forced America to ask on December 7, 1941. The question was whether America could build something good enough to win. The answer was yes. The answer flew at 380 miles per hour, and it was armed with 6 guns, and it was called the Hellcat, and it was the most successful carrier fighter in the history of naval aviation. Japan found that out the hard way.